Okay,
Patricia, introduce
I
yourself.
want to welcome all of you to our roundtable session for the Climate Crisis NCTE Roundtable session. And this particular group is addressing the whole topic of interdisciplinary climate change instruction, as well as issues having to do with environmental justice. So we have five presenters today, and we will start with Patricia Hans.
All right. I was about to say good afternoon, good evening. I'm Patricia Hans. I am going to present a unit on teaching the climate change in which I used a mock or a moot court simulation. I teach in Ridgewood, New Jersey, where there are still many Superfund sites. And so I'm going to take you through the unit via this PowerPoint that I know has a lot of information on it. So I'm going to be posting it to the NCT site, as well as the project guidelines and information and any background information. So you can actually take a look there and be able to see it. And I'm going to start with the presentation right now. All right. So I call this Students for Environmental Justice and Arguing for Clean Air and Water. It started with, I started teaching for climate change. I thought I would use a literature base, a lot of nonfiction sources. And I started with the whole idea of educating my students to become citizens, these civic responsibilities. And I asked them questions like, for whom am I responsible? For what am I responsible? And we engaged in a conversation that was, I would say, quite insightful. And I wanted to emphasize that, this is the way that we need to become good citizens to prepare for the future. So I kept asking them questions about rights. What rights do we have as citizens? Who is responsible for ensuring those rights? And are we responsible for holding those we deem to be responsible accountable for is the future and what the future will be like? So I started asking the questions about climate change and what actions we need to take. And I felt that they were distancing from me at this point in time. And I realized that they weren't really buying the climate change. They didn't really see it as impacting them. In fact, when I did research, it showed that people who evaluate global warming or how they think about global warming is that it really affects the United States, but doesn't affect them personally. So I started thinking that maybe all these things and posters that are going around, this division that occurred, and this took place a couple of years ago, but it's still taking place now, that we're very much divided on the climate change issue because of that inability to really see its direct effect on us. I spoke to them about New Jersey and all of our Superfund sites and the pollution that resulted from factories dumping and how people came down with cancer and how they were physically disabled as a result. And yet they still really didn't really connect to it. So I had to really, regardless of all these readings, I had to get personal. So at the time, it was discovered that there was a bacteria in the Ridgewood water, in the well water, and that gave me the idea to go into air pollution and water pollution and how it would affect them as students in their educational environment. I introduced them to Article 1 of Rights and Privileges of the New Jersey State Constitution, and that they have natural and inalienable rights. And would that include clean air, clean water, because it would deprive them of certain privileges if they can't learn and can't express themselves. And then I got into the Privileges and Immunities Clause of the 14th Amendment and told them, again, we discussed their further rights and the due process of law. So I said, if the air were polluted around your school and it affected you, how would it affect you and how would it jeopardize your education and therefore jeopardize your future? And so I asked them about what responsibility does the state and county have to its citizens? And does every student have the right to breathe clean air? And then I mentioned to them about Juliana versus the US 2015, which was started by a small group of students, the Guardians of the Earth, that initiated a suit against the US government for violating the Public Trust Act. And this is an act that goes way back to English common law, and that was adopted by some states. And we all know this case has made its way up, and I think pending right now before the Supreme Court on hold. This young man is one of the group members. He's now head of the Guardians of the Earth, and he has basically gone throughout the United States and delivered lectures. So giving them this inspiration, I said, now it's your turn. And I created this entire case that dealt with a fictitious high school, that students were suffering from asthma-like attacks and nausea, and due to the high levels of contamination in the water and in the air. And then I cited EPA and regulations and the Clean Air Act, and set up after the statement of facts, the entire case and what they would be doing. We divided them among them. Some would be justices. The roles were divided. Some would be attorneys arguing for the case, and the others would be respondents and representing the state. They each had to do research, extensive research, and we're talking about legal research. They had to not only research climate change, science research, but they also had to do case precedent and look at what's come before with evaluating similar type actions. And then we proceeded through the moot court. They spent a couple of weeks on the heavy duty research. Then they had to draft their briefs, and that was done collaboratively. This is actually the class as it was set up for that moot court competition. The petitioner's oral argument was orally delivered, and you can imagine it had to have that perfect logic behind it, and that sense of order in their delivery, so they could really hear is what they were speaking about, and how it was written. And they had to go through this process of thinking, this is the effect on us, and what causes this? Well, it's climate change. They had to do analysis on carbon emissions and how that's increased, the annual greenhouse gas index, and about the health effects, which they did. And they came up with the effects of this on the health and how it really impeded a student in the room to really express themselves and do their work. In the end, they actually decided, the court, the 9 justices who posed, for the state. And I was very interested in that, but they said it was case law. They said the state is doing everything and to address the pollution in the air. So it became very interesting. They, rather than decide it from a moral standpoint, which you would think they would decide from the students, they decided from a practical standpoint, saying the state was doing their due diligence with respect to monitoring air and water quality. In the end, what I came up with in my conclusions were that at this point in time, I want to stop sharing here, at this point in time, students became connected and really began to realize the effects of climate change on the air quality, on water, on themselves, and on their future. And it became a successful piece. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. Kylie, you're on.
Sorry, I'm just sharing my screen here. Okay, my name is Kylie Ham, and I'm a second-year history master's student at Western Michigan University. But prior to coming back to school full-time, I taught high school U.S. history, AP U.S. history, and sociology for 6 years. And one of the things I noticed in my last few years of teaching is I had more and more students interested in environmental issues, interested in climate change. And while I wanted to support them, I always felt a little intimidated about incorporating environmental history into my curriculum. I felt like I didn't know enough about the history of the research, or I would have to learn all the scientific jargon that I didn't know. And so fast forward to last spring, I got the opportunity to TA for an environmental history course. And I was so excited because I thought, I'm going to learn all this new history that I can incorporate when I get back in the classroom. And I was a little flabbergasted after a couple weeks when I realized that almost everything the professor was teaching about in the course, I already taught about in my US history classroom. I just needed to shift how I was framing the narrative. So today I want to talk to you about how to immediately incorporate environmental history into any classroom where history is being taught. And what I want to encourage really just K through 12 teachers to do is, instead of feeling like they have to learn all this new history, I'm coming at this as a novice, right? Instead of feeling like I have to incorporate all this new history or learn all these new things, what I can do is I can approach environmental history as a historian. Imagine that. So rather than thinking about the science behind climate change, one thing that is really impactful for students, and I was thinking about this when Patricia was just talking, is thinking about cultural attitudes about the environment and how that shapes human interaction with the environment, how it shapes policy, how it shapes economics. So I'm going to give you one example today during the short amount of time that I have, and you'll see what I mean. Okay, so at the beginning of US history, every single year, most US history teachers teach about English colonization on indigenous lands. So we talk about, the British coming over and clashes with indigenous groups that they encounter. So one way I can reframe this narrative that we tell every year is I can focus on cultural attitudes towards the environment and how that led to the interactions between the two groups. So if I'm looking at the English view of land, one thing I really want to emphasize for my students is that they have a very legalistic understanding of land. The English can't even comprehend of a world where there is unowned land, right? If I see a piece of land, there is a piece of paper somewhere that is telling me who owns that. This comes from a lot of sources. I could look at English religious beliefs. So, we have Christians who view the environment as something given to them by God that humans rule over, right? So the environment is for their use. I could look at push and pull factors in Britain at the time. So we have the enclosure movement, where you have wealthy wool merchants putting fences up so people don't have this communal access to land that they had, hundreds of years before this. I could look at the economic system that was in vogue during colonization, which was mercantilism, which was this idea that there was a finite amount of resources of wealth on the planet, and the most powerful countries had the most resources. So you begin to see how land is a huge factor in English colonization. So we have English colonizers coming over, and they encounter indigenous groups that have a vastly different idea of land. So if I'm looking at the indigenous view of land, we have a very communal understanding of land. So natives practice usufruct rights in most, in the eastern part of the United States, meaning that they had rights to use the land, but nobody owned the land. So the concept of land ownership was really just nonsensical to a lot of these groups, right? It would be like me looking outside and pointing at a cloud and saying, I own that cloud. That just doesn't make sense in their cultural understanding of land. That's not to say that they didn't use the land, right? So you would have oral agreements between different Native American groups. This pond, my group has first fishing rights during this point of the year, then I might migrate somewhere else and someone else gets to use that land. So the land is being used. Again, Native Americans used the land very much. They did controlled burns. They would build mounds in the Southwest. You have huge irrigation systems, right? So they're impacting the environment, but they're understanding land ownership very differently. Again, I could look at religion. So a lot of the indigenous groups that they encountered practiced animistic religions where they didn't see themselves as above nature, they saw themselves as part of nature. I could look at kinship organization of a lot of indigenous groups. We're going to do with the land what's best for the group rather than an individualistic view of land. So this is stuff that US history teachers teach every year, but if I can shift my focus and reframe it in terms of understandings of the environment, then it's going to look a little different. So if I look at these two vastly different understandings of nature and look at the clashes, it's going to have a number of outcomes. So I can look at King Philip's War, which again, something US history teachers teach every year. This is a war fought from 1675 to 1676. And one of the big factors in it was land use. We have English colonizers, animals grazing on native hunting grounds, and that's causing issues. I could look at deforestation. This had already started to occur in Europe when colonizers began coming over. And one of the things that new colonists were shocked about was the amount of free wood in the United States. It was really expensive to heat your home in England, and they showed up here and there's just wood everywhere. There's trees everywhere. So lumber is going to become a huge industry in the colonies. They're going to be exporting wood and really impacting the environment that way. It's estimated that 2/3 of the wood on British ships during the Revolution were from the colonies. I could look at overhunting and overfishing. Beaver populations in the United States were hunted almost to extinction in parts because of the fur trade, which has a huge effect on ecosystems when those dams aren't being built anymore. I could look at the decrease in salmon population from overfishing. So my point is that you're probably already teaching environmental history and you just aren't realizing it. So I want to encourage teachers to look at the curriculum you already have. You don't have to become an expert on something you don't know about, right? You can already use the curriculum you're teaching and reshape it to focus on how cultural attitudes we have about the environment shape politics, policy, economics, and center the discussion on attitudes, right, and culture. And then the environment itself becomes a historical player within your historical narrative. So is history being used at this point as a tool, such as like an oil history or the building of dams? Is history being an actor itself, such as the Great Flood of 1932 or the severe winter of 1886? Is it both, thinking about westward expansion or the Dust Bowl in the 1930s? So if we can recenter nature, the land, and the environment as a factor in our history, then it contextualizes current discussions we're having. So when Patricia was talking about divisions on climate change, if a history teacher spends the time contextualizing that our attitudes about the environment changes how we interact with the environment, then the current divisions we have might make more sense. So my last slide I have for you is just if you have any US history teachers that are students or you're in contact with, these are just really easy spots in the curriculum that they already teach where they could recenter the discussion on environmental history. So I'll let you read that. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you, Kylie. Okay, Amy, you're next.
Very good. Well, hello, everyone. I'm going to do a screen share here. And I'm at the University of Missouri, so I'm joining you from Columbia, Missouri, and I am part of the College of Education, our English education program, and I also direct our campus writing program. And so in that role, I've been able to work with professors from so many different areas. And currently we're doing this Linking Science and Literacy program. It's an NIH funded program working with middle school teachers across the state of Missouri. And what's interesting is that we bring scientists from different aspects of science, special education, and English language arts. And I represent the English language arts. But it's that learning together that has been really wonderful in this program. And the real goal is we think about using science and literacy together for helping students with their learning. And so when we think about climate change and in our classrooms, that's where the linking science and literacy seems to work really well. When we in the literacy standards, we're often looking at claim, evidence, reasoning, helping students joining into the conversation of argumentative writing. And so in our science, when we were talking with the scientists in our program, we were looking at how students may interact with things about climate change, but not really understand the importance of analyzing evidence and engaging with researchable questions. So that's where we looked at how we could help our students question and look at data, think about that evidence, use that evidence, be able to evaluate the evidence used by others, and then at that final bullet there, communicate that and justify that. So we wanted to see how we could blend what we do as English language arts teachers with what the scientists know. And especially our first 2 years, the program focus was very much around studies within climate change. And so I'm going to go through and talk a little bit about what we've done, but then I'll end with taking us into the website where we have materials available that the teachers and the leadership team have been developing. And so the real question then is, what does this mean for our classrooms and for our teaching? And so 3 things I'm really going to unpack here in these few minutes. One is how we define literacy. And if we think about literacy as not just reading and writing, but it's how we do make meaning. How do we make sense of the world around us, the texts around us, thinking of text with all sorts of definitions. So images, videos, and how do we read charts and graphs within our research articles? And that leads us into how do we approach complex text? And we know that least for myself as well, a former 7th through 12th grade English teacher, it was really easy to say to my students, well, you know, this is pretty tough. I can tell you what it says. But instead, we know that it's important to give students that support to read complex text effectively. So we want to think about that, how we use complex text, and then how we use all of this to help students join that conversation as writers. So here's an example of a complex text that was developed our second year of the program, and we call these anchor text. So it's an anchor that we are really working around. And this one is called Heat Waves in Missouri. Is it getting hotter or is it just me? And so a team of scientists had put together a version of a published journal article in a scientific text, in a scientific journal. And they created this that would be more at a middle school level. And even though you can't read it necessarily, you can see, there's a lot of text on here, and these are just 2 of the pages. And students are going to have to interact with some new terms and then things that may be going on in figures. In this case, it's a map. And so when we think about how do we take a text like this and share it with our students and give them the instructions so that they can be confident and ready to read this, we found that, of course, as educators, we know scaffolding is really important. And so we really have been working with the teachers and ourselves to think about how do we scaffold our instruction. And so we've seen that, again, at that top tier, we're looking at how do we help students reach that anchor text. And teachers have found that their students have been succeeding partly just with some stamina, with confidence, and seeing that, again, all of our students, we're not looking at just one particular group, but we really want to think about the range of students that we get to work with. How can we support them in reaching that complex text? So instructional scaffolds would be one way. So it might be how we use different grouping formations. It might be where we focus on particular skills, but it might be also where we are extending their learning through bringing in more intentional literacy strategies. I like to think of writing as an important learning tool. So I may use a lot more writing in helping my students learn how to read and use stopping and doing some note taking, really intentional, looking at purpose, looking at the different types of text features that are also appearing in a text. Content scaffolds might be where we take students into doing some more inquiry focused activities, really trying to figure out some things that are going on. For instance, when our first year, we were looking at Flight of the Bumblebee. So we were looking at pollinators. So we took some time to actually grab some flowers and dissect them and pull them apart. And then when we started looking at images of bees and then thinking about how do we really understand bees and other pollinators and how they work together, by actually getting our hands dirty in that and working through, that was a wonderful inquiry that was part of that content scaffold to help us understand the content of the text. But you'll also see that that first bullet under content scaffolds would be the multimodal texts. And that's what I want to talk about next, that we really started developing units that would build in a variety of text types. So here's an example. And again, you may not be able to read the text, but this is the kind of thing you'd be able to access on our website, where the teachers have developed lessons. In this one, it's a focus on understanding the impact of heat stress on the human body. So our second year is where we really looked at climate change from as temperatures rise, what's this doing? And through the various activities where they were going to look at different texts, videos, some inquiry, gathering some evidence on temperature, looking at climate versus weather, what's the difference? And we were going to have some doubters. We knew that both in the teacher group as well as students they'd be working with. So how do we help them think about evidence and what makes good evidence, and how do we use that evidence to build claims and analyze the claims of others? So a multimodal text set is where we can start doing some of that work, but it also is a wonderful way to engage learners. So here are just examples of different types of text that make up our 2 different text sets, one on Flight of the Bumblebee, one on Earth systems. And this is where, again, we see the importance of using poems, picture books, music and novels, photos and videos, really helping students get engaged with the topic, asking questions, looking at way people throughout time and in different modalities have engaged with the issues of understanding bees and pollinators and Earth systems. But research articles are a common thing, and the nonfiction research-based articles have been really important to bring in, to use those as also ways to scaffold students into reading more complex text. So here's an example then where we pulled together some articles that would have dealt with similar content and giving students opportunities to read those. It might be in groups as more of a jigsaw approach. It might be where students are all reading all three, but again, with a lot of different structures to support. And then on the right would just be some ways that they may journal their way through, creating a note catcher where they write this out. So on our website, I do want to show you where we have the materials. We have then the information background of the program and some information on the team members, the people that make up the team. And under resources and materials, this is where we define more about multimodal text sets. And then here are the topics. The first year we did Flight of the Bumblebee, and the second year Earth and Human Body Systems. And we're currently developing one on vaping, but with a little tweak connecting it also to the coronavirus. But when we go into the Earth and Human Body Systems, everything, of course, is based out of both the Missouri Learning Standards and the Next Generation Science Standards. There's a link to the anchor text, that is the text that I had shown at the beginning about how we are looking at heat stress. And then the scaffolds are summarized into a document that allows teachers to look to see which part, like if I'm a life science teacher, what are the resources? What is the link to the resource? What grade level? What are some comments about that? And so this is where, again, it's a team effort that we've all been implementing and then taking into our different classrooms and seeing how we can engage students to think about climate change and what it means to them and how they can be part of understanding complex texts within that. So I look forward to any questions or comments, and I will stop sharing screen. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Jeff, you're on. Jeff Scher.
Great, thank you very much. Hi, I'm Jeff Scher. I teach at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. I want to talk today about decolonizing environmental literacy. If we start, let me see, where we go. If we talk about connections and disconnections, I think it's really important to realize, as Naomi Klein mentions, that up until the 1600s, the Earth was seen as alive, usually taking the form of a mother. Europeans, like indigenous people all around the world, believed that the planet to be a living organism full of life-giving powers. So like this image of the Pachamama from the Andes. For thousands and thousands of years, humans thought of Earth as Mother Earth and had these deep connections. But then something changed for many people on the planet. And that is what I want to address here in terms of looking at the roles of Christianity, colonialism, and capitalism. Kind of looking at what Kylie talked about as the cultural attitudes. There is deep impact of these changes in attitudes that especially dominant powers in the world started to implement. And so if we go back in time, we look a little bit, Pan, the ancient Greek god of nature, was this wonderful figure that was part human and part animal, had some horns, had hoof feet. What do we think of a creature with horns and hoof feet today? Well, it's no accident. By the end of the first millennium, the Christian church used this image of Pan to symbolize the devil. This changed the past of living in harmony with nature to a new fear of nature that supported the belief in one celestial God separate from the physical world. This was part of that process, that change in attitude. And then a major force was colonization. And colonization, when we understand it critically, it involves a process of classifying, categorizing, and naming places and people that were new to the colonizers. As the colonizers landed in these places where they've never been before, seeing things they had never experienced before, they had to make sense of it. And what they did is they chose to start naming and categorizing. And this was a process that was very highly dehumanizing. It turned people and things into objects and commodities, and for the purpose of controlling and exploiting them for the benefit of white Europeans. So one of the aspects that's very critical that we understand about colonization is that this also was the invention of race. Colonialism not only separated people from nature, it also created the idea of separate human races. And then on top of that, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment provided these rationales for believing that white Europeans are better than all the others. So it wasn't simply that we had just separate groups, but these groups were in a hierarchy. And in this hierarchy, the white Europeans who were the colonizers were always at the top. So what we saw with colonization is the invention of the whole concept, the social construction of a race as an idea, and the notion of white supremacy as part of that. And this is deeply embedded in our ideas and attitudes about nature and our relationships with each other. There's a wonderful essay by Hopkins published in the Sierra Club that looks at this connection between racism and environmental justice. And he writes, "We will never survive the climate crisis without ending white supremacy. Here's why. You can't have climate change without sacrifice zones, and you can't have sacrifice zones without disposable people, and you can't have disposable people without racism." So understanding the deep connections with racism and our disconnection from earth and nature is a key part of understanding these cultural attitudes that have developed over time for the dominant power structures. Now, we don't see this everywhere in all cultures, but we do see it in what's happening in terms of the dominant power. And this is something that also has been long embedded within the environmental movement. The Sierra Club only this year finally faced up to its own white supremacist history. The group is speaking out against John Muir, its founder, and an environmental icon who fought to preserve nature and while at the same time supporting disparaging African Americans and Native Americans and supporting eugenics. So we need to recognize that environmental justice is intimately embedded with social justice and decolonizing racism. If we start to analyze ecological worldviews and the ways we see the world, we all used to see the world in balance and in harmony as interactions, as things that we were interdependent on. But this changed to this human-centric worldview that we saw through the development of colonialism, capitalism, Christianity, and these different bigger forces. And so it created this pyramid, this hierarchy of power, where humans, well, God and angels at the top, and then humans, and even humans were separated by men above women, and then different types of human over other humans, and then animals, plants, all in this power hierarchy. And this is really problematic. And this is part of what's contributing to our whole logic of domination of nature. Instead of living in balance with nature, we've now created this idea that we have the right to exploit and destroy. And that's exactly what we're seeing with climate crisis and different environmental problems, is because we don't have this connection anymore with each other and with nature. However, there are people and groups that still do. And it's the indigenous perspectives, and many of these still live on and haven't been completely disrupted by colonization. And recently, the United Nations published a biodiversity report where they confronted this. They said, if we want to stop the extinction crisis, we need to embrace indigenous worldviews. And I see this as a wonderful place for hope and for a direction we need to take. Four Arrows talks about, he says, such transformative change is largely about indigenizing our systems and institutions. It's about a worldview that connects us to nature. We need to connect back to each other and to nature. So I'll leave you with this final quote from Four Arrows, where he says, when one lives in such a way as to see a tree as a relative rather than a resource, diversity and inclusion as relates to fellow human beings follows. It's all connected. And the more we can understand how racism, environmental justice are intimately combined, the more chance we'll have to actually change the problems and solve what we're dealing with today. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. So Alan, you're on.
So I'm Alan Webb. I'm a former high school teacher in outside Portland, Oregon, and now a professor of English and English education at Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo. I'm going to be talking about mainly addressing English teachers, although a lot of my stuff will be interdisciplinary. I'll be focusing on student activism, and I hope it'll appeal to the broad range of people that are participating in this, attending this session. I'm going to put my PowerPoint on here. Let's see if I can get share my screen first. I want to put the PowerPoint up first. I'll share the screen first. Okay. And there we go. And start the slideshow. Okay, so my my talk is built around the idea of students investigating local climate crisis and activism. And I noticed that here. Let's see if I can put my picture back on there. Do you see my picture there? Okay, that's better, right? Now, the climate crisis is upon us, of course. We see this in so many ways. And I'm going to show a number of slides and not talk extensively about them, but they'll all be here. And they're also going to be on the NCTE, obviously the NCTE convention, but they're also site, and they're also going to be on our wiki, which Rick will, I'm sure, give the address for before we leave here. The climate crisis is threatening us in an incredible way, and it's young people that are really leading the charge to address the problem. There's a picture of Greta Thunberg behind. Do you guys see that on your screen? Okay. On my screen, I see all of our beautiful selves. Anyway, so I think that young people reach across issues of nation and class and race to be able to speak about their future. And of course, we're talking about generational justice. I really appreciate all of the interdisciplinary comments that are being brought together here. And I think we need the interdisciplinary approach to truly think about addressing climate change. But I'm going to make a case too that while climate change belongs in every content area, I think it's underappreciated the importance of it in English. In some ways, I think English is the most important area for addressing the climate crisis. In English, we're very used to thinking about the future. We're very used to thinking about utopias and dystopias. We can use cli-fi fiction, and we can imagine what's going to happen. In a science class, you're not thinking, it's not focused on, 50 years from now. It's not focused on imagining the whole, not just like how temperature is going to change or how plants are going to have to migrate, but it's focused on, we can focus in English on the social, cultural, and political and interpersonal dimensions of the climate crisis. We also in English are very concerned about understanding the perspective and the rights of others. We're also very concerned about ethical questions and issues of justice. We can engage in critical media analysis. Jeff is one of my great teachers on that topic. And we can help students gain a voice and become active in their communities. And that's another very important task for us as English teachers that really ties to addressing the climate crisis. We need, as teachers, to be thinking about our role in supporting young people to become voices that are going to be able to make a difference. We're in a crisis that requires very fast action, and it's going to be these young people, I think, that are going to be critical to making that happen. The rest of my talk is going to be built around these 5 points. Of course, we have the famous old slogan, which is, think globally and act locally. And I want to play with that slogan a little bit throughout this talk and talk about, we want to think globally and locally. We want to act locally and globally. Because climate change is a global problem and it's a local problem. And how do we do that? So first I'll be talking about inquiring globally, researching local impacts, centering climate justice in that process. And a lot of the things that Kylie and Jeff have been talking about are very important to that. Educate and act locally, and as we do so, think globally in terms of how to make action. When students start to inquire into climate change, they're going to discover how tremendously dangerous this is, and how the changes that are happening now are irreversible, basically, because the carbon dioxide is going to be in the atmosphere not only for thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. In human time, it's going to be basically eternity. So the changes we're making now, we can't go back. So what do? We're talking about this generation of young people, which the IPCC says we may get as high as 6 degrees Celsius of climate change by at the end of their lifetime, our own students. The Paris Agreement is to aim at 2 degrees, and even at 2 degrees, there will be massive impacts: water shortages, climate refugees, droughts, and this climate crisis. There have been 6 major extinctions in the history of the Earth. 5 of them are based on greenhouse gases and warming. The end Permian event, in which 96% of all life on Earth and in the seas went extinct. We are getting hotter 10 times faster right now than at the time of the end Permian event. And that end Permian event was at about 6 degrees of warming, which is predicted as possible within the lifetime of our students. I think the media is vastly underplaying, and certainly our politicians and certainly President Trump vastly underplaying the seriousness of this crisis. Everywhere is climate change ground zero. I didn't think that for living in Kalamazoo, Michigan. I thought, well, I'm relatively safe compared to other places. Other places will suffer first. And that's true. And there's questions of climate justice and so forth. But I want to make the point, wherever you are, if you're in the United States or anywhere, all kinds of things are happening. And here's a few pictures to illustrate what I'm talking about. On the lower left is a picture of a bunch of fruit trees. Michigan lost 90% of its fruit crop just a few years ago because it was unseasonably warm early on. The 2 top pictures are about flooding in our town just last 2 years ago. That flooding, by the way, of course, hit primarily in terms of destroying homes, primarily poor African-American neighborhoods. The bottom 2 pictures are a polar vortex, and these polar vortices are directly the result of climate change and the change of the Gulf Stream winds and so forth. And on the right-hand side, it's a picture of a natural gas plant which stopped, which had a fire, and it ended up vastly reducing the availability of natural gas right during this polar vortex in Michigan. Over 4 million households were impacted, and many factories had to shut down, and households all got alerts telling them to reduce their natural gas impacts and natural gas usage. I don't know if Kylie, if you were there, if that you got that alert, but when that happened, imagine if it had been a tiny bit worse. This is what climate change does: is it impacts our infrastructure and our systems and puts stress on them in ways that they can maybe handle or not. And at that point, there were millions and millions of people in Michigan who might have been frozen to death in their homes. Imagine the highways heading down to Indiana and Ohio and everything else. I mean, Kalamazoo, just like everywhere, is a climate change ground zero. And if you start looking into your own setting, whether, I mean, you don't have to be in the California fires, you don't have to be in the, the sea level rise in Florida, all over the country and all over the place. And that's one thing your students can be inquiring into, you see, because they got to inquire into the global impacts of climate change, and they got to inquire into also the local impacts of climate change. Another thing is climate refugees. We may be talking about 1 billion climate refugees by 2050, which is 30 years from now. We already have now like 70 million climate refugees, which is the most refugees that the planet has ever had. The thing is that these refugees are already in our communities, and we don't even know it. We don't even see it that way. I was giving a talk at a junior high school about the climate crisis, and a young man raised his hand and said he was from Florida. His family left Florida because their house was flooded twice and moved to Kalamazoo. But there are all kinds of people in Kalamazoo that actually fled, from New Orleans when we had that terrible storm down there, and from Houston. A lot of the Mexican and Central American refugees coming to the United States are, and they may not be called refugees, but they are fleeing the result of drought in Central America and Southern Mexico, which has been devastating their food production. And of course, the Syrian refugees, the Syrian war was started after a huge drought, all these places from the world. And one of the things that we need to think about is how can we get the voices of these refugees to become centered? How can we see them and hear them? And they're in schools. I bet you that almost every high school in America, or middle school, you can find people who can fit into this kind of refugee status. They may not see themselves that way yet, but if they understood what's going on, they might be able to see themselves in that way. And of course, we can do a lot to hear their voices. And that's, again, exploring the local impact of the climate crisis. Now, we have to center climate justice, and that's something that we've been talking about already during this session in really powerful, important ways. Who caused the crisis? And I'm not even just talking about nations here. I'm talking about social classes. I mean, corporations, something like, the 80 biggest corporations are responsible for 75% of all the CO2 in the world. And what is the carbon footprint of a billionaire versus the carbon footprint of, you know, a working class person? Who suffers the consequences? What does race and, you know, geography have to do with that? What about the fact that, you know, young people are the ones that are really suffering? I mean, I lived my life during the rise of CO2 levels. I was born, when I was born, it was perfectly fine. You know, I was 30 years old before it crossed the border over 350, and now we're up 414 or whatever it is. The way the next generation is going to have to live is going to be like 70 to 90% less carbon consumption than my generation. We need to talk with young people about this. They need to face these issues of their future and what the older generations are doing to help them understand the urgency of their taking action. There's a lot of other very important questions of climate justice, you know, that we need to be talking about. We need to center that. And we need to be educating, working with our students to educate our own local communities and to take action locally. These are all lists of things here that my students have done. I'm not going to go through all of them. I've done them in my English literature courses. I've done them in my English education, where I'm training future teachers courses, and in my graduate classes for teachers and so forth. Of course, student writing on this topic is so important. You know, writing about their own local areas and what it might look like, and using their imagination. This is what we have in English, is this incredible focus on using the imagination. And that's what we need to address the climate crisis. My students wrote climate manifestos, their own statements of belief about what needs to be done. And we don't usually train students to talk in a public voice and to take a stand on things that really matter, and to explain why they matter and how they can make a difference. And yet once my students had written these, they were suddenly empowered. And when there were local things happening, they were invited to speak, and they were able to speak. And they share their manifestos around our school in lots of different ways. And they organize things in our community and in a broader community. And that included, you know, even planting trees, which we can talk about what tree planting can do to help address the climate crisis. Another thing is finding ways to take action locally that are really creative. Right now, I'm in Cardiff, Wales, and the Extinction Rebellion had a week-long set of protests here that I got to be part of, and I can talk a lot about that. It was very, very interesting. But Cardiff is a city that's apparently the 6th most at risk in the world of sea level rise. And so they did some different interesting things. On the left, there's a picture of the Drown Inn. They went down near the ocean, which were also a big government building. They had all these life vests from they were somehow, you know, gotten from an airplane that was being decommissioned or whatever. And so all kinds of people laid down and had a drown in wearing these life preservers, and lots of pictures were taken. The media was there. My children were there. My children were laying on the floor, and we drew chalk circles around them. They walked up and took pictures of people. My children are 9 and 7. This was, you know, a great example of a way to illustrate the problem in terms of a local situation. Another thing that the other pictures is the chalk waves on buildings. This is where they went around to buildings and they painted these waves on there to show when it's 1.5 meters of sea level rise, where that was going to be on all these buildings. And they used chalk to paint with. So they painted them, they took a lot of pictures, and then they washed it off. It wasn't like they made a mess, okay? But it was like they were finding creative ways to illustrate and educate locally. That's what I'm talking about. Now, according to the Yale climate change study on public attitudes, and I don't think I can read this. Do you guys see all the text, or is it covered up by pictures? All right, so there's a surprising amount of support for civil disobedience, nonviolent civil disobedience to address the climate crisis. And many people say they would, I can't read the statistics, but you can read it, then would say that they'd be willing to support that and participate in it. So one of the things to think about, and this is where climate change and the urgency of this crisis really challenges a lot of our norms about how we're supposed to relate to our students, how we're supposed to understand the role of the teacher and the role of activism and the role of the classroom, and what responsibilities we have to change our content. This is the book I'm writing right now, is about addressing the urgency. It's called Facing the Apocalypse, the urgency and ethics of teaching the climate crisis. And these are the kind of things I'm really trying to understand and figure out. We need to connect globally. And so my students, here's a lot of things my students have done. And of course, thank goodness for the internet in some ways, because they can communicate all over the place. And they can, when they can learn to write in a public voice. Culture jams are a way for them to like expose greenwashing and other, it's a tactic that the disempowered can use to speak back to voices in cultural power. Made a online climate change cookbook for young people, because food is a big part, and the way we eat is a big part of impacting the climate. My students went out and were part of a school strike on, it was part of the Fridays for the Future. And so one of my points here is that when we do local actions, we need to think about how that connects to broader global actions. Greta wrote, today's the day, we're recording this on the day after the American election. I guess we still don't know who won. We certainly know that Trump did better than the polls seem to be predicting. I think that Greta kind of nails it here. You know, if Trump wins, maybe that will motivate people to start protesting enough and really demanding climate change that we need. But she's not happy with Joe Biden either, you know, and his policies and politics are nowhere close to what we need to address the climate crisis. This is not, you know, just to make a political point here, Bernie Sanders' program was $17 trillion. Joe Biden's program is less than $2 trillion. We're gonna need, this is to face the gravest problem facing humanity, threatening all of us. It's gotta become the top priority. And this is where our students have to know what's happening, and they have to figure out how they're gonna take action to try to address it. And of course, this is the book that Rick and Jeff and I co-authored. And what I really like about this, I'm pretty happy about this book. I'm pretty proud of this book in all modesty. This quote from Bill McKibben, who talks about how the inability for us to address the climate crisis is largely a failure of imagination, precisely the reason we have English class. And I think that that power of the imagination we can use in all of our disciplines. We need to use more of it in the sciences. We need to use more of it in the social sciences. We need to see that being able to imagine what can happen and understand the perspective and the suffering and experience of others is critical to all of our disciplines. Okay, so that's my little talk.
Okay, thank you, Alan, and thank all of you for your excellent presentations. I thought it was really interesting, the strong interdisciplinary nature of how we can think about not only focusing in English classes on these issues, but bringing in science and history, social studies, economics. It's a very rich curriculum that you presented here. If any of you watching this want to access the PowerPoints that presenters use, you could access those PowerPoints on the NCTE portal for the NCTE conference. You can also access them on our wiki, which is a wiki for all of the roundtable sessions. We have two other roundtable groups, one on teaching literature and climate change, and one on composition and teaching climate change. What you just heard was our third group. And that website is, I'll give you the little address, is Climate Crisis NCTE 2020.pbworks.com. That's Climate Crisis NCTE 2020 pbworks.pbworks.com. So again, I want to thank all of our presenters, and hopefully we'll have a chance to share this out with the larger public. So thanks again, and so long, and we'll see what happens in the election.
Thank you.